Good morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well this morning. We are going to continue on with our mission series a little bit here. We've been learning about Cyrus and how God has used the heart of this foreign king, an unbelieving ruler over Israel who is a tool in God's hands. And I think that relates to our situation today. We're going to spend one more week kind of looking at Cyrus and what that means for us today. And I'm sure that many of us before this COVID season never imagined the kind of pointed questions that could arise about faith and worship and government that all of us have been trying to answer. And to some degree, each of us has been responsible to answer for ourselves. And part of the reason why we never anticipated that is that because in Canada it's been fairly easy to coast in the faith, just to like I say, coast, just to go with the flow without serious repercussions for practicing your faith. But now we're having to navigate the difficult waters of divine and human authority. That's a balance we've never had to struggle with, though probably in our lifetime, though you look around the world today and so many churches have to try and navigate those waters daily. Well, the first crisis, when it began, many of us were challenged by the question of, many questions. What does worship look like in God's eyes? What does He want from His church? How are we commanded to express worship? How are we commanded to come together? Why? Why should we? And what happens if we don't? And how long can we delay certain biblical commands in order to facilitate other biblical commands? Like the one today that many of us are trying to balance is love your neighbor versus worship the Lord your God, or do not give up the assembly of the saints. And we're seeing that many Christians have different answers to that. And it's no surprise that there's different answers because we've never really had to question that before. And it's very fascinating throughout Christian history how crisis has often created the grounds, the circumstances in which the church discovers her theology. One of the other questions, of course, is, where are the lines of obedience to human leaders? And we're seeing many answers to that. In this church, our leadership has felt strongly a few points. The first has been that there is a difference between what God commands from us and what we ought to be free to do. Those are two different subjects. What God requires from me and what someone else should allow me to do are two different things. And they should be separated. And why should they be separated? Because it's very easy, as you're preaching the gospel, if these two things are too closely married, for someone to totally misunderstand the gospel as being about your rights. And let me tell you, the scriptures don't place a lot of emphasis on your rights and claiming your rights, as we are wont to do in our society. They do place a lot of emphasis on the rights of others, on having a responsibility towards others, including freedoms. And that's traditionally what Canada has been based on. But at any rate, one of the things that can also happen in our confusion over these two subjects, God's commands and our freedoms, is that the gospel can actually become marred by seeing only my freedoms. And God can become shaped in my image towards the things that I think I should be free to do. And actually the church is really struggling with this for the past decades, for a long time, as God has been reshaped into human wills. And so as a church, we wanted to create a space where people can obey the commands of God as they must do, even if that means against recommendations, or were it to happen, thankfully we're not in this place, but were it to happen against human laws, we must place the commands of God first. But what are those commands? And that's a tricky subject in which we're going to have disagreement yet again. So the second thing that we felt strongly is that as a church, we're commanded to worship together. It's common for people to say that the church is not a building. It's the people of God wherever they are. And while there's some truth to that statement, it's actually a bit misleading. The Greek word for church was specifically chosen out of all the Greek words for Israel in the Old Testament. The New Testament writers chose one word from the Old Testament. They chose the word gathering. Literally, the word church means the gathering of the people of God. So while the individual Christian makes up a part of the people of God, it's the gathering of those people that is the church. So it's not true that it's a building, but it's not true that it's the individual either. The word that was chosen by the New Testament was intended to convey gathering. It's literally in the name of church. We can gather in many different ways, of course, and people have been discovering that, and I think it's wonderful throughout this past season. But however we gather, we have to achieve certain goals. In fact, God will, as far as I'm concerned, require it of us. We must be regular in our gathering together. We must have adequate leadership to disciple people. We must not create something so unfamiliar that it ends up pushing away the most spiritually vulnerable, leaving them to walk on their own and probably walk away from the faith and worship of God, sometimes altogether. Whatever we do in gathering must not exasperate and discourage believers from gathering and worshiping. And whatever we do must do all that we can to welcome visitors. And so it should be easy to find. This is why in our church we've continued to worship largely, though with some changes, as we did before. It's the best way we know to meet all those goals at present. And we don't always have the luxury of a smaller group that they may have of emphasizing some of these to the exclusion of others. Somewhere in the church, all of these goals have to be met. Well, the third thing that we felt, and who would have guessed we ever would have had to think about it, was that God, in fact, does not invite us, but commands us to sing and to sing together. Christian worship isn't abstract. This is something that I've seen throughout the history of our last 200 years of the West. We're abstracting the faith into ideas instead of concrete realities. Christian worship isn't just of the heart, though I readily grant it's primarily of the heart and it all comes from the heart. I will not fault anyone in this time who's convicted in their conscience to abstain a while longer from singing in order to love their neighbor. But the fact is, I think we all have to admit there is an expiry date on how long we can delay God's delight to hear our voices. As a person who often worships quietly, I'm speaking of myself here, I usually focus on the words of the songs, and I haven't always been as outspoken as I now realize I should have been. And in the last year, even before this COVID season, I began to see and be personally convicted that God has given me a voice so that he could hear it. And he's not the kind of God we often make him out to be. He's not satisfied with whatever kind of worship we choose to bring. Otherwise, Cain would never have had a problem. God has wants. And he makes demands. He desires things from us, not only for us. And one of those things he desires from us is to hear our voices. And more than that, he commands us to sing together in Colossians 3:16, for example, teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your heart. See, even before all of this began, I was beginning to see that God has designed us to grow through singing. It was actually an essential component to Christian growth. My voice, I saw, that voice that I wasn't always using, was given by God because it has a profound effect on the people around me who hear me. It encourages them. It unites us by our vocal agreement together, our common activity. And it trains my children and anybody else growing in the faith to worship as well. I have to confess, I'd given this almost no thought before reading a number of worship leaders over the past year, and I don't know how I missed it. How long can the church thrive without my voice? Now, I recognize not everyone will hold that opinion. It's simply the one that I hold. But I just give, and I'm not going to give a comprehensive defense here. That's not my intention this morning at all, just a bit of an explanation. I'll give one more example of why I believe we must not abstract the faith into merely ideas and the heart. If worship is just a matter of the heart alone, why did Daniel ever end up facing the lions? He was commanded not to pray for 30 days, yes. And he recognized that he could not do that without being disobedient to God. And we might note that there's no scripture I know of that says you must pray every single day to the Lord your God. None that's explicitly stated. And yet Daniel knew that this is a command of God nonetheless. It's implicit all throughout the scriptures. Well, even that wouldn't cause a problem. For Daniel to have simply prayed, I mean, prayer is really a matter of the heart, isn't it? He could have sat in a corner of his room, he could have been silent, and he could have just prayed to God day after day. But Daniel recognized that was something he couldn't have done. He opened his window toward Jerusalem. He got on his knees, and he prayed out loud for anyone to hear passing by. He couldn't do anything else. The reason was that in Daniel's mind, worship was a matter of both body and heart. The fact that worship is both body and heart is the very reason why God had to save Daniel from the lion's den at all. Now, these convictions, as I've searched through them and others in our body have searched through them, has led to one of the most uncomfortable situations I've ever been in. In fact, I think it's the hardest decision I've ever had to make in my life, if you can believe it. Having to choose between safety and singing, between the wisdom and advice of our government and a feeling of obligation towards my God. But I am grateful for a recent conversation I was able to be a part of with our Premier and our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Hinshaw, where 3 times in 5 minutes, Dr. Hinshaw told us, which I take seriously, she does not recommend congregational singing. But then she added all 3 times, except if you feel you must for religious purposes. I couldn't believe my ears the first time I heard that. I thought, for sure I've misunderstood something. But then there was the second, and then there was the third. She didn't have to admit it once. I know of no other leader on this continent who has acknowledged the kind of difficulty that goes on in my heart when I have to choose between these 2 things. And yet she did understand. And I can't tell you how encouraged I was just by the fact that she would care enough to speak that. Not only to speak it, it would have been enough just for her to consider it, but then to share it and affirm, I know how you might feel and how these obligations tear at you. That was a really positive conversation. I left, and in fact she was very positive about the place where she felt our province was at and thought things were well in hand, and though she didn't know the future and how fast things could get out of hand, she was really quite pleased with our progress currently. And so, as I reflect on that, I also reflect on the fact that she did give caution, that there is danger. And in fact, that the only way that I am guarded from danger and those with me is if the Lord himself favors and protects us for doing what we believe is obedience in his name. As I look about this continent, I'm incredibly grateful to be in the province that I'm in. And not just my province, I'm incredibly grateful for the leaders whom I have. We are enjoying the most freedoms of any Canadians as far as I can see. I thank God for our leaders. I truly do. If they were to call me up and ask me my opinion on all of their policies so far, it's true I might raise some points where I don't see eye to eye, but here's the thing, that won't happen for the same reason that I'm not going to call them up to ask what I should preach on. Because God has not given them that authority to preach, just as he's not given me the authority to govern. And this is the lesson I want to focus on today, despite this prelude. Here we are, more than 6 months into an ordeal that has been frustrating, confusing, soul-searching, discouraging. We're tired from our struggles. We're wanting to move on. Perhaps we're even a bit jaded. We're watching many churches demonstrate the magical Christian capacity for division. And I'm so grateful for the church in which I'm in which people have been willing to respect each other, even if perhaps they could do a better job. But I'm thinking it can't be God's will for his church to be defeated or fractured in this time. So the question is, how do we press on? In a situation like our own, our church has really done quite a bit to emphasize God's authority over human authority. But that's only half the story. How do we nevertheless acknowledge God's authority in human authority? Something we've explored a bit to this date, but not as much as we could. How do we avoid becoming cynical towards human power, which will ultimately lead to rebellion against God himself? If you rebel against human power, you are rebelling against God. So how do we acknowledge our Cyruses for all their warts, forgive me. Well, for that I want to look at Matthew 22. And we're going to look at Caesar, who's another Cyrus, so to speak. I hope you don't mind me running these metaphors together. But Matthew 22, verse 15. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you're a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Don't you love how they're buttering him up? Come on. We know you don't mean what you're saying. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Was there a little bitterness there? You pay no attention to us. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. Jesus' opponents feel that they can surely trap him. In fact, Rome-resisting Pharisees, Pharisees who don't like Caesar much, and their ideological enemies, the compromising Herodians, who really, so to speak, got into bed with Rome and were compromisers, they team up for this one mission to put an end to their common enemy. See, Rome had imposed many years ago a head tax on every man in Palestine, and it was deeply hated by most Jews. As D.A. Carson notes in his commentary, paying the toll tax was the most obvious sign of submission to Rome. Submission to a corrupt and exploitative and abusive and godless regime. How could any God-fearing Jew submit to such an abomination? Would God not view this as compromise from his own people? Wouldn't he be displeased? This isn't even to mention the moral dilemma a Jew would feel when they paid the Roman tax by the customary Roman coin, the very coin that Jesus now holds in his hands. Because on one side of that coin it reads, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. What a blasphemous claim Jesus holds in his hand. This is the coin I pay tribute with, the one that says that our dead Caesar, Augustus, was divine, and that Tiberius Caesar as well is some kind of demigod? Could any Jew participate in that tribute without being guilty of idolatry? On the other side, it said of Tiberius that he was high priest. Yet another disgusting false claim. High priest of blasphemy, perhaps. That's what Jesus is holding. This was rather a hot-button topic. It had caused full-scale revolts against the Romans in the past, and as the Jews saw it, there are only two sides to this story. One side rejects the tax, and therefore utterly rejects Roman rule. The other side accepts the tax, which means spiritual compromise and allying oneself with the bad guys. It's not hard to see ourselves in this dilemma, is it? For most of us, this season has been the first time we've felt we've had to navigate government and faith. We may see only two positions as well. Obey all that government commands and wisely delay certain commands of God, just to be prudent. Or the other side might say, obey only what God commands and shrug off government, it's not important. But the Jews were wrong to see only two sides to this argument. And if we think like them, we are wrong as well. Jesus proposes a third road that will not be without conflict and won't be without offending both sides, by the way, but will refuse to resort to extremes. Jesus responds, give to God what is God's and Caesar to what is Caesar's. You see, we aren't the first generation to experience difficulty in knowing how to honor God and human rule. It's been a common theme in Christian history. And both extremes have been present. Utter rebellion and way too comfortable with evil authority. authority is much more evil than ours, I might add. Our present has actually been generally the rule of Christian experience. And Jesus' response had not occurred to his inquisitors. What do you mean? A nuanced understanding of divine authority, that we obey God first, but might have to be required by God himself to serve a human master as well, even in the case of Caesar, a very sinful human master? I don't know how long our current crisis will go on. I do know this, that those who continue to walk by faith through this struggle will still have to discern how to walk faithfully. And all who walk faithfully will hold the commands of God in one hand, in the highest esteem, a challenge in themselves, by the way, just to discern, and in the other hand, the command of humans, given authority by God. No Christian can dismiss human authority entirely. I remember when Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. The next day, 1,000 Democrat voices cried out, "Not my president, not my president." No such words can ever be uttered from Christian lips. If God has placed the authority, it is authority over you. Even when we cannot fully obey or support our rulers, which happens in every single generation, by the way, this does not dismiss government as a whole and allow us a free pass on all matters. Now let's assume the worst, just for the sake of our argument, okay? Let's assume that we had a totally self-centered government, willing to do everything in its power for its own advantage, including exploiting its own people. Would that be enough to upend the Christian responsibility we have towards rulers? We don't have to wonder. That was precisely the kind of government that ruled in Jesus' day in this very story, and ruled in Paul's day when he also called us to honor authorities. That ruled in Peter's day when he said, "Submit yourselves to every human authority." Yet Christians were called to honor and obey insofar as possible, and it wasn't always possible. We shouldn't think of ourselves as excused today either. I wish to impress on you one thing above all: the importance of watching your heart in this time. If you leave here testing your heart, guarding it, ensuring it's right before God and others, it's soft, that is enough for me. The heart leads to wisdom and right action. Harbor a heart that cherishes and lifts up our leaders and that is for them. And though we're tired, perhaps disillusioned, frustrated, groaning, we will know that something has gone awry when we notice bitterness and hostility. If you see those, they need to be addressed. They are not a normal part of the Christian life. Okay, they might be a regular and common part of Christian experience, but they're not normative. They're to be dealt with and handed over to the Lord. I think of the Chinese church. You probably know by now that I try to learn a lot from the persecuted church across the world so that I can become wiser from their experience and not have to experience things myself before I get the clue. And what I've learned from the Chinese church is that those very pastors who every day break the law, every day, by leading worship, by evangelizing, by spreading Christian materials, they also every day pray with their hearts wholly interceding for their leader, Xi Jinping, who's perhaps the most wicked and oppressive leader in the world. Certainly in terms of the number of people he oppresses, absolutely no comparison across the world. And yet the hearts of these pastors are soft towards the very man who makes their lives miserable, their very tormentor, the very one who, by the way, drives them further into Jesus to rely on him because the life they're living cannot be lived by themselves. They honor Xi Jinping before God. They tell outsiders how much they love him. In fact, it's almost hard to believe the love that they claim to have for him. They surrender many freedoms to obey him. Then they continue to obey God above him. You and I have the tremendous responsibility of never surrendering our consciences, and yet at the same time, never turning anti-authoritarian. The devil never attacks with only a single blade. Yes, he would love to see Christians surrender God's authority to human beings. And again, with the Chinese, they have not done that. But the enemy would be just as pleased to see Christians refuse all human authority altogether, to turn their hearts against their leaders, and so turn their hearts against God himself. The lawless human heart has been our race's problem longer than any other temptation. Did you know that? And if your heart can be turned against one human authority, it can be turned against any human authority. You will see unrest in all your relationships. You don't want to go down that road. It will not lead to life. We're living in this period of time, I truly believe, so that we might learn how to both obey God above men and how to be humbled in our own eyes, willing to love, honor, and serve men, even if we feel mistreated. This is a time in which God will tame our hearts from the wild freedoms that we're used to. And frankly, we are used to a wild freedom. But God is now teaching us disciplined, self-denying imitation of Christ. That's what we call Christian discipleship. The constraining, self-denying humility Paul spoke of when he wrote 2 Corinthians 5, starting at verse 14. For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. Now listen to how this works out. Because Jesus died for us all, and we all consider ourselves dead in Christ to the life we once lived, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. Listen, someone who's died to themselves doesn't really have a whole lot of rights to claim. You may be feeling constrained for the very first time in your walk with Christ by the responsibility of being a disciple of Jesus and a representative of his way. Doesn't mean anything's wrong if you feel this way. It means you're recognizing the responsibility and calling of Christ himself. We, of all people in Canada, here in Alberta, should be able to find gratitude for our leaders, as I have been able to in past weeks. What a shame it would be. Think about this. If the good faith that our leaders have extended toward us in trying to understand us and even accommodate insofar as their wisdom can grant, wouldn't it be terrible if we returned that good faith with ingratitude on our own part? We mustn't allow legitimate concerns, and we might have them, to erase our gratitude for our leaders. I absolutely believe right now this is the number one matter Christ wishes to establish in our body. Learning to practice discernment and patient submission. And it's going to be a challenge for a while yet. Continue in humility. Do all things without grumbling and complaining. Can you say you've done that and obeyed the scriptures as we're commanded? The time of testing is not yet over for the church. Don't fade before the finish line. Keep your heart pure and don't resist one master simply to fall prey to the master of self-rule that battles for your own heart. No matter where we stand in these issues today, we must all practice patience for one another. Remain sensitive to those who feel they must resist certain recommendations in order to serve God. Remain sensitive to those who feel obeying government on a certain issue is serving God. Respect their space, both figuratively and literally. Now, I want to leave in this way. Having offered a challenge like this, there's a few concerns I'd have for you. One is that you might feel offended, that in some way I've attacked or oppressed you. Be careful if you feel offense. I've not removed your responsibility or your freedom to judge your own situation day by day. In fact, my very sincere impression from my conversation with the Premier is that he doesn't want to do that either. He doesn't want absolute rule in the recommendation he makes. But I've said nothing here but the barest teaching of Scripture, that God's authority is greater than man's, but that we are nevertheless still not free to dismiss our leaders or turn our hearts against them, no matter how we feel about their leadership. Secondly, so please don't allow yourself to walk out here in offense. If you do, I'm concerned that it's an indication of something in your own heart that should be addressed before the Lord. The second thing we might feel is a twinge of conviction. Maybe I have been so dismissive Maybe I do need to sit and ponder and allow myself to be constrained by the name of Christ that is upon me and witnessing to him. Maybe you determine anew to obey government all the more, and then maybe you're tempted to turn against your brothers and sisters who see things differently. I am overwhelmingly grateful that the members of our church have shown restraint in judging one another. I don't think they've been perfect, but they've recognized the need for patience. Many I speak to have admitted that things are not clearly black and white, and they've chosen to wait on God to judge his own. I've not heard of a single church like ours, and that's why I'm so grateful. In every other church, some have issued ultimatums. Follow every single recommendation from the government or I'm never coming back here, they say. And it might be true. Others are on the exact opposite side. Follow any recommendation and I will never come back here. Those strong feelings are understandable on both sides. There's a lot invested in this. Nevertheless, giving free rein to those feelings is not the course of the humble and godly. So, well done for your love for one another. But I warn you that the opportunity for disunity is not yet over. Hold strong in patience. Except in matters of glaring sin, allow God to judge his own servants. Don't fade just before the finish. Now, I don't fear a virus, really, though I recognize it's a reality and a risk. I don't fear the virus itself. I don't fear personally a loss of life, or even in my family a loss of life. It would be devastating, but that does not cause me fear. Over many years, I have offered to God constantly, take my life when you want it, take my spouse's life when you want it, take my children's life when it will be beneficial to your kingdom. Take my wealth, take my home, take my land, take anything, God. But one thing I beg God not to allow in my life, and that is, don't allow Christ's name to be dragged through the mud because of me. We all have to make hard decisions about how we lift up Christ's name in the eyes of others. But that's the only thing I really fear in this life, is that Christ's name would be blasphemed or mocked because of my lack of self-control. At a time when Christians air their dirty laundry publicly in every media space, my goodness, I can't believe it. Why in the world would you allow unbelievers to know about your problems with the church or with another Christian? I strongly feel that each of us must do what we need to see Christ glorified above all. Pray for your government. Ask God that you should love our leaders as he does. Ask to love them. It will transform you. Keep yourself from rushing for all of this to be over. I know everyone wants it to be over tomorrow, but listen, seize the discomfort that brings you to prayer earnestly, maybe for the first time in your life, because of your need for relief and renewal. Learn to pray for things beyond just the discomforts that you're facing. Pray beyond this season. Pray for enduring transformation of our nation, which is a far greater matter. Grow in your heart for Cyrus. As God directs us between the dangerous poles of pride and fear in this season, he will empower those who are both humble and bold to serve him more effectively. And that's what I hope for you. Why don't we end with just a couple of questions and prayers? You know, what's been your biggest struggle in this time would be my first question. As you've tried to discern how to navigate government and worship, what's been your biggest struggle? What have you determined in your walk? What's the biggest weakness in the conclusions you've come to about gathering and worship and government and obedience? Be honest about what's the biggest weakness, the biggest kind of spear that can drive a wedge in there between your argument, because there's one in all of ours. On the other hand, as you look at those who disagree with you, maybe they are more closely following the recommendations of the government, maybe they're less closely following. Can you see good sense? I want you to speak out loud. What's the good sense that you see in that opposite opinion? Can you see God-fearing reasoning there? As you think about your own church, what do you imagine for your church when you come back together? What are you hungry for when we can all return? Now, a couple of prayer requests. Number one, I haven't mentioned this already, but we are praying for Iraq this month, our persecuted church. Still a country in disarray where Daesh is still causing trouble, and that's not to mention Turkey and American interests. And the church there is just kind of being hammered on all sides. So pray for the believers there. Purity of faith, strong witness, encouragement in Jesus. Pray over this, the unity of the body. We can't all agree on how to prioritize the commands of God, and yet pray for understanding in your heart. Pray to honor God and human authority, and pray for love that causes you to cling to your brothers and sisters in Christ. Pray for a speedy end to this COVID season. Even though I tell you to grasp it while it lasts, do pray. Pray for protection, especially in this region. We've been so blessed here in Clive Church. And continue to pray for God to raise up. We so desperately need God to continue raising up, especially leaders, but in under and with and around and over these leaders, whole churches that have discernment to follow God and who see the stakes with spiritual discernment of compromise in their present time and of what really is the way of God and what is not. How desperately we need that. Anyways, be blessed this morning. Struggle over this word I've brought you. Draw closer to the Lord as you hunger for truth. And above all, love God and love neighbor as yourself. Be blessed.